all these beautiful people here today. Oh my heavens. Hello. I am so happy. Look at all these beautiful people here today that I know and love. Hey Laura. Hey Michelle. Hey Lori. So great to see you guys. Hey, hey. Hey Lori in your studio. Michelle in the house. I just sent you an email, Michelle. Okay. Yay. Oh, I love it. I love it. Welcome to Tuesday training, or as Lori calls it, Tuesday tidbits. That works for me too. It's one of my favorite days of the week. I'm super excited to be here. For those of you who've been here a million times, welcome back. I love you and I love seeing you. For those of you who are either here for the first time or watching the replay for the first time, because we know that there's lots of you. I've been hearing about all of you watching on the replay, which I love. Welcome back. If you've seen a replay before, and if you've never been here either live or on the replay, welcome for the first time. My name is Gina Schatz. I am the developer of the Schatz method. I'm also your host for today. I love talking functional anatomy with movement and manual practitioners, and that's what we're here to do on Tuesdays. That's what we talk about for an hour. Well, we don't talk about that for an hour. No, we do talk about that for an hour, but I talk usually for the first part of the hour, and then I open up for Q&A. So if you came with any questions today, please be prepared to either come off mic, use the chat, type it in, come on video if you're not already on video, whatever works for you to get your A's to your Q's, because that's what I'm here for. And last week, we had a different format, actually, which I kind of liked. We didn't do a Q&A. We did the whole thing with strategizing. And so we're going to do like a hybrid of that today and see how that works, because I like to have active dialogue with each of you. So last week, we talked about a busted ankle, not broken, but deeply sprained, strained, both ankle. And we walked through how to troubleshoot that and what to do about it. And we did some of that from the view lens of the Schatz method, but also just some of it from anatomy and functional anatomy. So you don't have to be a Schatz method practitioner to weigh in on conversation. All are welcome here, and we all know what we know. And my intention is to fill in the gaps if there's something you don't know and inspire you to continue on your path. So today what I wanted to talk to you guys about was hip flexion and the action of the psoas and what happens in static posture. Oh my heavens. So this just came up in conversation and dialogue with me and somebody else a few days ago. And I thought, oh, I'm going to bring it to Tuesday training. And so here we go. So let's start with what is, and Stacy Harris is coming in too. Welcome. Welcome, Stacy. I'm glad you're here. So let's start with what is hip flexion? How do you know if the body is in hip flexion? Michelle's typing. I know your body language by now by heart. Awesome. Stacy, if you want to type in and use the chat, you're welcome to do that. You can come off mic and talk if you want to do that. You can wait for someone else to come up with the answer. Hey, Stacy, I'm glad you're here. Forward bend, psoas contracts, glutes lengthened. Awesome, Michelle. Okay, cool. So what's a common everyday posture that everybody's in that we know is hip flexion? Sitting, yes. Sitting. Yep, that's pretty common. In fact, I'm doing it right now. In fact, before I came on to do more sitting at my computer for more hours of the day, I did the opposite action because we know that as soon as we sit in a lengthened position for 49 minutes, fascia binds, and it takes 20 to 30 minutes to undo that bind. Sitting for longer than 49 minutes means it takes, yes, Michelle, 3 to 4 hours to undo the bind. So if you sit at your computer for 4 or 5 hours or 2 or 3 hours or 1 hour in a day, your 1 hour yoga class or Pilates experience at the end of the day is not enough to undo the bind in that fascia. And as soon as the fascia binds, then the muscles are involved with that bind, meaning that the muscles get restricted. Even if the muscles are perfectly healthy, the fascia is bound, they wrap around muscles. Now, if all of that made sense to you and you're like, check, remembered, got it, awesome. And if that's something that you yet to have in your arsenal of knowledge, cool, let us support you in that because that's really helpful information. I got the fascia information from the International fascia conference, the first one actually. Luckily, they continue to do them because the science and research that they bring to the table in that conference is pretty incredible. Because, you know, those of us who are movement manual practitioners, we're not sitting in labs with microscopes and data points. That's not what we do. So we need to have some science to support the work that we do out in the field. And we need to bring our field work back to the scientists to have them fill in the gaps for us. So that conference is amazeballs. I love it. And that's where I learned about fascia binding. And we know that fascia is so dense that when it does bind, it can create a new shape in the body, which means, again, doesn't matter how healthy the muscles are. If the fascia is bound, the muscles can't move readily. So back to sitting. Sitting is hip flexion, the joint action of hip flexion. And if you also weren't clear on what that joint action was, that's okay too, for like another minute. But you really want to know joint action, because why do we want to know joint action? Lori and Michelle have been asked this question 100 times. Why is it important for movement and manual practitioners to know joint action? What happens if we don't know joint action? What's missing from our work and our results?
Well, because muscles move bones, and when a muscle crosses a joint, it moves the joint. Yeah. Is that what you were looking for? Something different?
No, that
was it.
Still lit me up. That's straight out of Muscles and Movement.
Yes. I know.
Yeah. And so why do we need to know the joint action? We know that muscles move the joint. Yeah. And we know where the muscles are tells us what joint it moves. Super important. But why does the joint action itself matter? Why do we need to know that it's hip flexion versus something else? How does that inform our treatment and what we do? Why do we need to know joint action? It informs us when things may go awry in the body. Yeah. What else? Why do we need to know joint action? Why do I rattle your chain about what the joint action is and what joint is doing flexion? What, like, it's so simple. You guys are going to be like, oh, well, that was obvious.
It's going to be so simple. I can tell. I can tell.
It's going to be so simple, because when we know what the joint action is, then we know what muscle we're working with. Right. Yeah. And then where it connects and what it does and all that. So we know which muscles are involved. Exactly, Laura. So we want to know what muscles are involved so that we can target what we're doing towards the muscles that need our support. So if we're in hip flexion, or we're in shoulder flexion, or we're in anything else, our minds take us to that part of the body and the muscles that do that action. Okay, cool. So back to hip flexion, sitting. The strongest hip flexor in the body is a Muscles and Movement quiz right out of the gate. The strongest hip flexor in the body is the psoas. Exactly. So now we have psoas, and we have hip flexion, and we have sitting. And we also added in a little conversation about fascia. Okay, great. So when the body's in hip flexion, and we know that the psoas is the strongest hip flexor in the body, when the body is in a seated position or in hip flexion, is the psoas contracted or lengthened? Now that's an easy one out of the gate. The psoas contracted or lengthened if the body's in hip flexion? It passively contracts. Okay, smarty. Yes, exactly. Giving us the full answer. Yes, it contracts, which means, do the muscle fibers move towards each other or away from each other? Towards each other, yes. And passively, so what does it mean to be passively contracted, Michelle? Versus contracted. Go ahead.
It's easier to come off rather than type it. So it's passively contracted. You're taking it into its shortened state, but it's not necessarily building strength. Like our psoas may not be super strong. And then when you're actively contracting it, you're working the muscle. So you're contracting it, maybe adding a little bit of load or some tissue adaptation to make it stronger.
Yes. And that is the key distinction that I wanted to bring up for us today in Training Tuesday. Exactly that, Michelle. When we strengthen a muscle using the lever system the way it's designed, one side of the lever system contracts, the other side of the lever system lengthens. We know that as exercising a muscle on one side and stretching the muscle on the other side. That's layman's speak, but that's basically the same formula. And that's great. And that's awesome. But what happens when we shorten a muscle and we're not actively contracting it? Is it getting stronger? And this was the question that came up recently. Like I said, a few days ago, I was talking to some practitioners and they were like, well, yeah, if the origin and insertion move toward each other, that's contracted. But is it stronger? No, it's just shortened. Right. How do you strengthen a muscle? What do we know about what mechanically has to happen for a muscle to strengthen?
You have to add load or time under tension.
Yep. And then what? What are the spindles doing?
They come apart as they get stronger, like the muscle spindles come apart, and then when they repair post lift or post strengthening, as they repair and come together, that builds that strengthening.
So you're talking about repair in tissue after load. Mechanically, when we talk about the lever system, a contraction is when the origin and insertion move towards each other, and that is creating the strength in the muscle. Then the lengthening is when the origin and insertion move away, and that's what we know as stretch, right? So in order for us to contract a muscle, in order for us to strengthen a muscle, it's got to contract. And in order for it to contract, it must first be lengthened. So if we know that in order for a muscle to contract, it must first be lengthened, we know that, right? Like if a muscle is contracted, if origin and insertion are moved towards each other, and we go to load bear, how much more can we move the origin and insertion toward each other? It's already there. Can't really contract it more. We're just bearing weight. We're not lengthening to contract muscles, which means the activity in the lever system is missing, which means we're getting less strength from all that load bearing. So given that, do we think it's important to stretch or lengthen before we work out? What do we think about that? Lots of rules of thumb out there on the internet, in the interwebs. Everybody's got an opinion, just like me.
Gina, it's so funny that this is coming up. I just looked this up this morning, and it was both. It was both. A lot of it, so say 9 out of 10 posts said no. And then there were a few that were like, absolutely. I'm like, okay. Okay.
Yeah. What do you think, Michelle?
I feel like it's kind of a complicated answer because you do need to warm up before you go right into a run or a workout. And you also need some time to recover, the cool down. So anecdotally in my body and from what I have read and ascertained, warming up before doing some more plyometric type movement to get the muscles activated is important. But I prefer stretching afterwards. So I get the muscles ready. Sometimes that does look like taking them in a lengthened state, but I'm not necessarily stretching. So for example, I do glute max TVA work before every run. So technically I am putting my psoas in a lengthened position, but I'm only doing that to activate my glute max because I need that to push myself forward to go running. So yes, I guess there is lengthening, but I'm not doing what is technically labeled stretching.
What's technically labeled stretching?
Like static stretching. Like I'm not just doing a forward bend for a couple minutes, a quad stretch for a couple minutes. They're a bit more of active work than passive.
Okay. Yep. So static stretching versus engaging the lever system.
Yeah.
So when you use your example of I'm activating glute max, hyperextension of the hip before I run, which is a lot of also hip flexion, should be equal parts hip flexion to hyperextension, right? Because we know the pattern of gait. So yes, you're activating glute max and you must lengthen psoas to make that happen. And you're also lengthening psoas so that it can also contract while you're running. In hip flexion. So it goes both ways. When we work with the lever system, it's both. So in patterning, which we've done in the method, and I think that's where you're speaking from, Michelle, because we talked so much about activating glute max and repatterning. inside the shots method. We're doing that because we see that as an imbalance. So it's true that that's an imbalance, and that's part of that pattern of gait that we get to focus on. Without it being a regular imbalance, just thinking about the body's mechanics and how it's built, the lever system should be equalized all the time. There's not one side of the lever system that's more favored than the other, but they do different things in alternating fashion, right? So yes, so use your example again. You're activating glute max, and yes, the psoas is lengthening, but not as a secondhand happenstance. It's happening equally in that lever of hip flexion to hyperextension. So that's what I want to emphasize in this conversation, that we must lengthen in order to contract. And when we're talking about imbalance, or when we've talked about imbalances in patterning, what we've thought is that I need to lengthen this side so that I can contract the other side. That's true. And it's also true on the same side of the lever. In order for me to contract anything, I've got to lengthen it first. In order for me to bring the origin and insertion towards each other, they must be away from each other first for them to come together. And that's before there's an imbalance or any kind of postural stuff that we often address in our method. Does that make sense, Michelle? Does that add a different
Yeah,
focus?
I think that where it gets like muddy is like the conception or the ideas around like stretching. So that's why I'm trying to like, I get that question a lot too. Like, should I stretch before or after I run? And because I know that they're asking, should they just be doing static stretching? Like, well, there are certain moments that could be beneficial to running.
Mm-hmm.
You may feel a stretch, but it's not like the stereotypical stretching. Does that make sense?
It does make sense, of course. That's why I say stretching doesn't exist. Like one reason it doesn't, I say that, is because anatomically it only happens in response, right? The brain doesn't have a wire for stretching. And if you guys don't know that yet, please let us get you that information, because it's super important whether you're movement or manual practitioner. So that's one reason why we say that, yes, action is contraction, because that's the way the brain is wired. And we don't want to just focus on the contraction, or excuse me, focus on the stretching. We want to actually add contraction where it's needed, because most of us aren't contracting readily in joint action. And that takes us back to what I said a few minutes ago. How do you know what to contract? Based on the joint action you're coming up with, right? What's needed for joint action. And all of that's laid out in our anatomy guide, of course. And so we're just taking this conversation another step forward. So I understand why on the internet it says depends, right? Like you read 10 articles, 5 of them say stretch first, 5 of them will say that you don't need to. It depends on what you're considering stretching and what your focus is in that moment. So for example, let's do some more real examples. If someone sits for an hour or more a day in front of their computer in a static held hip flexion, we've already said that we know that that means that their psoas is shortened, not strengthening and contracted, but shortened, and it's passively contracted, meaning that the origin and insertion are moved towards each other, but there's no strength being generated. So if that's happening in the psoas, what's happening in the posterior part of the pelvis? Lengthening, exactly, because we know that that's the lever system. So if we have extended lengthening in the back of the pelvis, an extended passive contraction in the front of the pelvis, and that person's body wants to go for a run, or the body doesn't want to go for the run, but the person in that body wants to go for a run, do you think that offering them some stretching, to use a layman's term, would be appropriate? Or is it okay for them to get up after sitting for an hour and just jog? Just start running and let the jog be the warm-up. What do we think? They've been sitting for an hour. Their psoas is in a lengthened, passively held, contracted position. We know the fascia is bound. The glute max and posterior part of the pelvis is lengthened. Is it okay for them to use their beginning part of their run, jog, as a warm-up, or do we think we should invite them to stretch?
I'm just having a really hard time with just the word stretch, which is why
Good. Okay, good.
I can't answer because I just, the stretching thing is throwing me off.
Good. Then my intention has worked. Yeah, I hope that stretching sounds like nails on a chalkboard to us. Not that it doesn't exist, but the concept of it, like you said, Michelle, most people are like, should I stretch as if it's a thing? And what we just talked about is that stretching means that something else is contracting, or it's not really stretching. It's just pulling origin and insertion apart from each other. You following, Lori? Yeah, okay, good. I wasn't sure if you were stretching because of your cute little beanie cap or because of what we were talking about. Okay, great. Yeah, so let's rewind the tape a little bit. Stretching doesn't exist as a function from the brain. Brain does not have a command for stretch. Stretching happens in response to something else contracting. We talked about this in lots of courses. And when a body part is contracting on the opposite side of a joint, the other side will lengthen. That's what we're used to calling stretching, except that common stretching does not involve the contraction. It's just like a static hold, origin and insertion moving away from each other. So I get it why that is not working for you, for sure, Michelle. Let's just use lengthening of the lever system in this conversation instead of the word stretching, and the question's still on the table. If a client person is sitting at their computer in hip flexion for an hour, we know the fascia is bound, we know the psoas is passively contracted, we know the back of the pelvis muscles, glute max specifically, is lengthened, and they want to go for a run on their lunch break. Do you think that it would behoove them to operate the lever system before just going for a run? Michelle says, I would say activating the muscles. Ooh, let's just check that chat again. Activating the muscles before a run is recommended before kicking off. Yes, operate the lever system. Okay, great. In what way? What specifically should they do going from extended sitting for an hour to running? What do they do in between before they start running? What do you recommend mechanically? Glute max TVA. What else? Anything else? Lori, are you typing? Looks like your screen's moving, so I can't tell if you're typing or not. And I don't want to answer.
Yeah, I was typing. I have my my laptop on my lap, so it's a little.
Okay, good. What were you typing?
I was doing the what does someone do in between the sitting and the running, and it, like intuitively, just after what we've been talking about. Yeah. It feels like some movement, like, this is where I'm wrapping my head around, because everything's lengthened and passively contracted, or, well, not stretch, passively contracted, and to get up and run, I feel like the muscles would just, it would feel too jarring. So, but they don't need more passive stretch, to Michelle's point. It's pushing up against like what I've been told and what I've heard, and then the reality of it comes, and it's like that gets to be, I don't want to say, when you learn something new and have a new realization, it takes a second to kind of get your brain wrapped around. That's what I'm going through right now.
Totally get it. That's why we're having this chitty chat.
Right. It's like,
right.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So Michelle, if you were to offer glute max TVA and add that to the conversation that we're talking about now about just the lever system and balancing the lever system, not addressing specifically an imbalance, what would need to happen in that lever?
Glute max lengthen, or glute max would contract psoas would lengthen.
Yes, exactly. So we know then that when a muscle is contracting or when a muscle is lengthening, it doesn't do it as a solo artist, because we know about reciprocal inhibition. And if you guys are listening and you're not clear yet on reciprocal inhibition, let us get you that information. It changes the game when it comes to movement. Okay, great. So if we know that we're addressing the lever system, because we're not looking at the body yet as an imbalanced problem to solve, we're just looking at balancing the lever, we know that the psoas must lengthen and glute max must contract, which means even if it's not static hold stretching, we know that something in that lever system should be addressed so that both sides have an equal chance of participating on that lunch break run without causing a problem. Because we know that there's a fascia bind out of the gate. And that's before we even know if both muscles are equally strengthened on both sides of that lever. Yeah, so we got to do something about balancing the lever, especially when we're adding velocity, which running is, and any impact, which running is. Walking is, not too different. Okay, great. So let's take this a step further then. So if we're talking about just the body sitting, we're in hip flexion. Psoas is under what type of stress? Psoas is under what type of stress? Yeah, Lori, go ahead, say it.
It's under contraction, passive contraction, right?
Yep, so that's contractile stress. So we know that there's different types of stress on a muscle. And again, if you're listening and you don't know what the heck we're talking about, let us get you that information, because there's different types of stress on a muscle and all of them equal tightness. In our clients' experience, they say it's tight, but not everything that's tight needs to be released. Exactly. So psoas is under contractile stress when the body's seated in hip flexion. Cool. What if the person's body is seated and one leg is crossed over the other at the thigh? So they're crossed at the knee, so their thighs are overlapping each other. Are both psoases in that scenario under equal contraction? No. Yes, maybe? No? Okay. What's the difference?
There are other muscles at play that are now also in contraction, and possibly one side is lengthening.
One side's what?
So like if one leg's crossed over over the other, and you're bringing maybe the right leg is crossed over the left. So the adductors on the right inner thigh are contracting, meaning that the outer hip of the right leg is now lengthening, but both hip flexors are still in that contractile state.
Mm-hmm. We know that because we have now introduced a new joint action. And when we know a joint action, we know what muscles are at play. Exactly. Let's take out the extra joint action just for now. And let's talk just about the psoas. So the body's in hip flexion and one leg is crossed over the other. Right thigh is crossed over the left thigh. Just the hip flexion part. Are both psoases under the same amount of contraction?
I'm sitting like that, and it feels like my top leg is under more contraction because it's drawing in towards me more.
Right. The joint angle is different on the right than the left. Yeah. So that psoas would be under more contraction than the left one, for sure. Given that scenario, someone sitting at their desk for an hour with their leg crossed over, or in a business meeting or at dinner with their legs crossed, do you think that that person's lever system needs anything when they stand up after an hour? Oh, yeah.
Yes.
And do you think that it's possible when they sat in that way asymmetrically, just talking psoas at this point, we're not even talking about the other joint actions involved yet, just considering hip flexion, right thigh crossed over the left thigh for more than 49 minutes, do we think that that could create an imbalance in the body structurally? Yes. Yes, exactly. And that's when we start working with dysfunction and things are possibly awry and we need to work on patterning and maybe even do body work on them. Exactly. Okay. So let's say now that we're talking about someone who's seated and they don't have their shoes on, or maybe they do, but they don't have their shoes on, and they tucked one foot underneath their bottom. I'm doing that right now, by the way. So one foot is on the floor and the other foot is tucked up underneath their booty. Yeah, a lot of us kind of do that a little bit. I just got called on it, actually. One of my practitioners saw me and she said, stop doing that. I'm like, oh, I've trained a beast. Awesome. Okay. So we're seated. One foot is tucked under We're only talking about the psoas for now. I know that there's other stuff that's happened. Joint actions have shifted. Totally get that. But we're only still focused on the psoas for now. Are both psoases, I feel like there should be a psoi or something, but I'm sure it's psoases for plural. Are both psoases under equal amount of contractile stress when you're sitting and one foot's tucked under?
How do you sit like this?
Well, hypermobility, baby. Makes all kinds of Cirque du Soleil stuff. I didn't hear your judgment. I just heard the question, by the way. What are you doing? I know. People sit all kinds of crazy ways. Have you ever stared at anybody in public? Have you ever ridden the subway in New York City? Hello. It's a field day for your eyes. I'm telling you, all kinds of stuff happens in people's bodies. Okay, so they're sitting with one foot tucked under. What do you think? Are both psoases under the same amount of stress? Is there equal amounts of hip flexion?
It feels like I like to sit like that too.
Thanks for bailing me out. Lori.
Yeah, I do. Like the joint, like you were saying, the angle's different. And like I have mine, do you have yours under your foot under your butt? I guess it doesn't necessarily matter.
Yeah, my right foot, my left sit bone.
Oh, got it. Oh, right there. Okay.
Michelle's like, forget it. Y'all are freaky, and I don't want to do that.
So
Totally cool.
I can do it, and I'm hypermobile in those joints. I don't see the allure. Like, and I got cushion behind me, and it's still, I'm like, I can feel, I can rock my left sitting bone. Like, anyway, I'm getting on a tangent, but I think they're under different, and I think the leg that's crossed under, because you're not on your sitting bone anymore, on the right side, at least I can't, I mean, I guess I could push it down, but that doesn't cause awesome things in my body. So naturally, I'm not on my right sitting bone. I am on my left sitting bone. So my left one is more likely to be in alignment, my left side, and my right is not. So they're off, the right being in more of a contractile state.
Right, what being in contractile?
The psoas.
Okay. What about you, Lori? You're muted, honey.
Well, when I sit like that, my hip bones feel pretty level, but I suspect they're not. So if they're not, then there's no way that they can be under the same. That's what the same amount of contractile stress.
Okay. So do the height of sit bones change the psoas contraction, or does it change something else?
Not my sit. Oh, wait a minute. What'd you just say? It's just the height of your.
Yeah. Do the height of your sit bones
bones.
or how level they are on your seat, does that change how much contraction you have in your psoas, or does it change something else?
I think it changes something else. It hikes my hip.
Yeah. What's the hip?
Yeah. I was like, and it started breaking up, and I was like, oh wait, it's QL that's now under more contractile stress on the side.
Yeah, and QL and psoas can start to appear like they're the same problem, given symptoms and chief complaints from clients, for sure, right? So we get to look.
Yeah, that's all the runners I work with.
QL.
It's all QL.
I know.
Because they're doing a hyperextension of the hip, but the glute max isn't doing it. QL is doing it, and then they end up with low back pain after they walk.
Right, exactly. I know that's your focus, Michelle. That's why I was not taking you off of glute max, because I know that pattern changed the demographic of the people that you work with, and I love that. And there's more. There's just more, right? Okay, so if we know that we're sitting with one leg doing something different than the other, sometimes that's worse for the psoas. Sometimes it adds something else. Just considering the hip flexion part, not extra joint actions, which of course then there's obviously more muscles to contend with. What about if you're sitting with your right ankle over your left knee? What does that do to the psoas? And let's all just change positions. Yeah. So now we're still talking about just the hip flexion part of sitting, but now we have the right ankle over the left knee. What's going on with the hip flexion? What's going on with the psoas?
I would say, I mean, you're just you're added another joint action. So you're seated, you're in hip flexion. You added another joint action, external rotation of the hip, which comes with a whole other different set of muscles. But as I'm doing it, it might be different in other people's body depending on the amount of external rotation that they have. But I have a decent level of external rotation. So as I'm sitting here with my ankle crossed over, I don't feel that I've added in any spinal flexion or lateral flexion of the spine like I did when I was sitting on my ankle. So I would think psoas is still doing its thing, contractile, and we just added another joint action.
Okay.
Unless somebody doesn't have a lot of external rotation and then they have to then compensate for the lack of external rotation.
Yep. So when you sit with your right ankle over your left knee or either ankle over left knee, there is lateral rotation of the hip. There's also abduction. So there's a lot more joint action going on for sure. I want to rewind just a second though, Michelle, with the last position we were in, when you sat with your foot tucked under, you said you were doing lateral spine flexion.
Or when I was sitting on my ankle here, I can feel here even now, and you can kind of see it in my shoulders, that I have some lateral flexion of the spine. I am leaning to the left. Or not, like I can be really dramatic and do this, but it's really slight. And that was from my foot coming over under my left buttock. So my left
go ahead.
QL is in a contractile state.
Correct. And imagine for a minute that a person's body that you're working with does not have as much hypermobility as you, so that it doesn't show in their shoulders per se. They don't actively laterally flex their spine. It's only in the pelvis. Their left sit bone, your left sit bone could still be higher than your right without the lateral flexion of the spine and still be a QL problem.
Okay.
Because QL hikes the hip. Doesn't mean there has to also be lateral flexion of the spine. That's other joints doing other stuff. Yeah. So in less hypermobile frames, we might not see all the drama that we see in hypermobility, where hypermobile people can also sometimes look confusing. You're like, oh my God, what the heck is happening? It's all the things, right? So it goes both ways. You can miss stuff in a hypomobile constitution, and you can get distracted by a hypermobile constitution, depending on what's going on. That's why we're walking through it slow by slow. Okay, so let's go back to crossed ankle over knee. And yes, we've got more joint actions on board for sure. Thinking only about the hip flexion for now, only the psoas as the strongest hip flexor in the body. Is the psoas equally contracted on right and left sides when the ankle's crossed over the knee?
I vote no.
Okay, how come? What's different right to left?
Because when I'm just going to say it might be wrong. It's cool.
Cool.
It's cool. It's cool.
Yeah.
Because I'm trying to remember the psoas. Let's see, origin, insertion. Is it the head of the femur? Head of the femur, right? So when I don't know where at the head of the femur, but that's okay too. I can't remember. When I externally rotate it, it feels like it's going further away from the origin. And then, well, wait a minute. No, because I'm in contraction. It's got to come towards it. Is it because I don't know.
Okay.
I mean, I do know, but I don't know.
That's why we're doing it. So
I got down a rabbit hole.
Do you have one of your ankles crossed over your knee, Laura?
Yep.
Okay, so even as a hypermobile, which I know your constitutions, even as a
Mhm.
hypermobile, look down at your femur.
Mm-hmm.
Is one femur higher than the other?
Yeah, let me get, oh, yeah, the one over the top. Yeah.
Mhm. Which
Uh,
changes the angle at the joint.
Yes.
So that psoas is under more contractile stress.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. I had to physically do it and look at it.
Mhm.
Okay.
Okay, great. So now question, if folks are sitting equally weighted on their sit bones, feet flat on the floor, shoulders over their hips and everything in the axis except for hip flexion going on, we already know that that's plenty. We've decided that they absolutely get to address their lever system once they've been there for 49 minutes or more. Got to do it because length and holds do fun things to the body. But once we create an asymmetry, once there's a unilateral pattern going on, and as you said, Michelle, one side of your body was doing one thing and the other side of your body was doing the other, it's really the innominants that are able to move, the innominants in the pelvis. So one innominant's doing something different than the other innominant. And when I asked you guys a few postures back, do we think that that could create a structural imbalance? We said yes. So do we think that any type of asymmetrical sitting could create a structural imbalance? Yeah, like pretty easy math on that one for sure. If someone has a structural imbalance in a held position and fascia is now bound in that position, do we think that the social term of stretching or addressing the function of the lever system before getting up from that position and going for their lunchtime run is sufficient? Do we think that in unilateral sitting for a held period of time, do we think that what we talked about before, addressing the lever system so that they can get up from that seated position and go out for a run, do we think that's sufficient? Lori says no. Michelle says yes. Okay, quantify your answers, my loves. Why is it yes?
I would say that it's yes, taking out the should I stretch before I run and instead replacing that with we need to balance the lever system before you decide to add that velocity.
Mhm.
So yeah, let's address if you're having these asymmetries in the body. Let's, for example, you're staying with hip flexion. Psoas needs to be addressed. So we need to take the hips into a, either however you use your language, extension of the hip or hyperextension of the hip. So the psoas can then lengthen before you then go on the run and use the psoas.
Mhm. Okay, and then what about the structural imbalances that we've said are most probable if they're sitting asymmetrically, asymmetrically? What do we do about those structural imbalances? Do they just go away when we engage a lever system again?
Well, in my humble opinion, I would always, and I always do start with optimal sitting. So my hope is that over time, those structural imbalances would be corrected because all of my clients in an ideal world, I know when they are, because they get really excited when they come in the session. They're like, I sat on my apex all week. I'm like, that's great. So you would work with them on that repatterning, but it wouldn't necessarily help for the in the moment of you just had lunch, you want to get up and run, or you're going for a run on your lunch. So that one stumps me. I would work with them on repatterning to sit and stand optimally. And then over time, we no longer call it sit and stand optimally. It's just you're sitting and standing. But yeah, aside from the things that I know I do, like I'm going to go for a run after this call, and I know the things that I am going to do, which do include activating the glutes and the hamstrings before kicking off. I'm unsure.
Okay, I will come back to you and fill that in just one moment, Michelle. Love your answer. Lori, what do you said no. Why do you think that activating the lever system would not address structural imbalances?
Because you're not starting from a place of, kind of to Michelle's point, of optimal. You're not starting from that and then engaging or adding weight, or because it doesn't, you know, it doesn't work with me. When I'm imbalanced, I can add weight to it, but I'm not back in optimal.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Yeah. So we've talked about alignment being an external alignment and being an internal structural alignment. I can be seated on both my sit bones and have a torqued sacrum. My sacrum is torqued. I'm not activating glute max equally on both sides. Doesn't matter how many times I engage the lever system, not going to happen. So it depends on if their structural discrepancies equal a measurement. And for those of us who are listening, we do measurements in the SHOTS method, which we don't talk about on Training Tuesdays, but both of these gals know them. So that's why we're talking about it at this level here. If sitting optimally, standing optimally, and engaging the lever system works and they show with no measurements, fine. But don't assume that just because they're sitting and both sit bones are touching their seat, that they are without any structural discrepancies. And we know that when there's structural discrepancies and you continue to activate the lever system, whether you're weight bearing or not, that can lead to an injury. So we've got to measure. The only way to know is if you measure. But it's not to be assumed that just by activating the lever system that structural discrepancies are corrected. Functional muscles being lengthened and contracted, absolutely. By engaging the lever system back to the way it's designed so that both sides of the lever are working equally and balanced, absolutely. Back to functional movement and corrected lever systems. Structural imbalances may or may not be corrected by that, even though muscles move bone. That's why we measure, and that's why we address measurements and then bring them back to patterning. Okay, well, that was super fun to walk you guys through that and to play with you. What are you thinking, Laura? You're thinking.
Well, I'm just going back to the initial question of, what do you tell somebody to stretch before or not?
Great question. I'm so glad you brought that up. Let's wrap it with that. So what do we say? Do they need to address the lever system functionally if they've been in extended hold sits or any posture for that matter? We're just using sitting in this conversation.
Oh, maybe we did address that. Yeah, they do need to do that.
Because why?
Because of the passive contraction and lengthening of being seated for over 49 minutes. Yes.
Okay, and then engaging the lever system after they've been in extended seat. Why? What does that change by engaging the lever system? We know that the extended sit created passive contraction of the psoas and sitting in the posterior body. Got it? And then what does engaging the lever system do? Why do we want them to do that? Why are we going to tell them, yeah, go ahead, stretch, but stretch this way by contracting instead of just holding muscles in a lengthened position? We're going to teach them how to stretch the right way, of course. Why do we want to tell them to do that?
Right, this was the whole thing that we were just talking about.
Yeah, we're just wrapping it up. We're just coming back.
Yeah, and just
closing the loop.
Yeah, thank you. So that their muscles do what they're designed to do.
Yeah, we have a balanced lever system, which means joint action is possible. Absolutely. And then if they have a structural discrepancy and we're still telling them to engage the lever system, why? If we've said that engaging the lever system may or may not address the structural discrepancy, why would we still have them engage the lever system then?
Well, you still want strong muscles. You still want, whether you're misaligned or not, you still want to have strong muscles.
You want to have access to the muscles. You definitely want to restrict access to the muscles and have a structural discrepancy. Now you're definitely in for an acute session soon, for sure. And we know, as their wise counsel, that just engaging the lever system after extended hold sits does not disqualify the need for them to have some structural work, because they may have a structural discrepancy, especially if they're sitting asymmetrically. So when someone says, should I stretch before I run? Maybe. How do you sit? Oh, I have a standing desk. Okay, different story. How do you sit? I just sit. Okay, great. Sit down and show me. What's your comfortable position? And as they're sitting there for 2 seconds, they look optimal. And then when they start talking, just before 1 minute, they'll cross a leg or an ankle. And you're like, aha, they do not sit optimally. There's an asymmetry going on. Depending on the amount of asymmetry, maybe they don't jam their foot under their booty, because people like Michelle wouldn't do that. People like me and Lori may, but they might sit with an ankle crossed or their knees crossed or what have you. Now we know that they have asymmetry, and now there's a greater chance that they have a structural misalignment. The answer is yes, you need to absolutely engage the lever system, and there might be something else that's causing some of your symptoms, because the way you're sitting can cause a structural discrepancy. Let me check that for you. And you measure them in 3 minutes or less, and then you have all your information. Does that answer it for you, Lori? Closed loop, bow on the top?
Closed loop, yep.
Okay, fantastic. Any other questions on this one? So fun. So fun. Okay, any other questions about anything else? Any cues that I can A for you? And bye, Lori. Have a good client session. And Jane, I know that you're here and you've been listening in the distance, and that's super cool. And I'm glad that you're here. And if you have any questions, you can come off mic or you can type it in the chat as well. And I know the rest of you as well. You can type your questions here. And by the way, if you're watching on the replay and you have questions, please add them in the comments, and I will always answer all of them. I know some of you email me directly, which I also love. You're more than welcome to do that at any time. And if you leave your question in the comments, other practitioners can be served from the answer as well. So do what's comfortable for you, but definitely ask questions. Michelle, you got any other questions? No? I had fun playing with you today.
Thank you.
Enjoy your run.
Thanks so much. I'm going to go activate my lever system now.
Yes, that's right. Okay, loves. Thank you so much for playing with me today on Training Tuesday. I had a super fun time. I really appreciate each of you who show up every week, whether you're live or on the replay. I love that you're doing the work that you're doing, and that you are continuing to pour into yourself so that you can do exceptional work. Thanks for confirming what I thought. Okay, good, Jane. I'm glad you played along and that you were right on track with us. I love that. To all of you who are here live and on the replay, continue to do great work in the world, and